Welcome to Reparations, the historical and economic perspective, the second of a three-part series. We are pleased to have you with us on this
Fix your
wonderful
glasses.
community. I am Deitra Reiser, founder of Transform for Equity and co-chair of Multiracial Sinai at Temple Sinai, Washington, D.C. We are honored to present this three-part event with the Union for Reform Judaism and Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills. The first program, Reparations, Unpacking the Meaning, provided us with a framework for understanding examples of federal governments, local governments, and individual institutions, examples redressing past harms for the Holocaust, war crimes during World War II, and the harm of 250 years of slavery and more than 150 years of systemic racism. Today, we are going to hear from three scholars on the historical and economic reasons why redress is called for. We were also reminded that we as a reform movement passed a resolution affirming the need to study reparations. I was in that room that day. I had the distinct privilege of voting on the resolution. And that speaks to why I wanted, and my task force committee wanted to do this program. In 2019, at the biennial, I experienced quite a bit of racism as I walked through the halls of that hotel and the conference room. And it was more racism than I had experienced in quite some time. And it was surprising to me because I was in our community. I had been invited to speak about the work that Multiracial Sinai, the committee at Temple Sinai, had been doing over the past 3 years of racial justice, equity, and belonging, and helping our temple towards the work of being anti-racist. So thinking and going back to that auditorium where there were hundreds, thousands of us in that room, hearing the resolutions and voting on it, it was a point of pride and pain. When the resolution was called to vote on, it passed. Most people were, I think, happy and pleased that we were the first religious movement to endorse the study of reparations. And when that vote came, there were boos. And my stomach dropped. And at that moment, I was hurt and proud. And then I realized that those boos meant that there's work to do. We are a large movement with many beliefs and thoughts. We also hold dear our need to strengthen Judaism for now and for generations to come, alongside the Reform Action Center's goals of working to educate, inspire, and mobilize us to advocate for social action. At this moment in our country's history and in our movement, reparations for the descendants of those enslaved is an important means to correct the wrongs of more than 400 years. To better understand the historical and economic impact of slavery and systemic racism, we are pleased to have Professor Richard America, Dr. Valerie Wilson, and Mr. Richard Rothstein provide in-depth context for why reparations are called for. I will give you a few highlights from their biographies. We will first hear from Professor America to provide historical context for reparations that includes slavery and Reconstruction. Professor Richard America has published on economic development in distressed areas, small and medium enterprise development in Africa, corporate philanthropy and community development, and social marketing and community revitalization. He has written and edited many books and journal articles on these topics, including the seminal Paying the Social Debt, The book is described as redefining the complex problems of racial, economic injustice, poverty, inequality, and lagging competitiveness and productivity in the United States. This book argues persuasively that the social and racial problems in the United States cannot be solved until we acknowledge that the haves truly and literally owe money to the have-nots. We will then watch a video called Segregated by Design, based on Mr. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, which Ta-Nehisi Coates called brilliant, a fine understanding of the machinery of government policy. Mr. Rothstein has written extensively on race and education throughout his career. Mr. Rothstein is a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. He will be joining us for the question and answer portion of our program. To close the presentations, Dr. Valerie Wilson will speak on the current economic realities facing Black Americans. Dr. Wilson is director of the Economic Policy Institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy, a nationally recognized source for expert reports and policy analysis on the economic condition of America's people of color. Prior to joining EPI, Dr. Wilson was an economist and vice president of research at the National Urban League Washington Bureau. She has written extensively on various issues impacting economic inequality in the United States, including employment and training, income and wealth disparities, access to higher education, and social insurance. We will now hear from Professor America. If you have questions, please direct them to Lisa Tucker in the chat.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you. The title I'm working with is "What Can Religious Groups Do About Unjust Enrichment, Chronic Poverty, and Systemic Inequality?" Black median income is $18,000 below white median income. The Black unemployment rate is about twice the white rate, and the Black poverty rate is about 3 times. 3/4 of white Americans are homeowners, about half of Black Americans, and Black Americans' homes value is about 65% of white home value. Half of these gaps result from unjust enrichment, illicit transfers, many kinds of hidden subsidies, wrongful takings, and a process of excess accumulation over 400 years. The other half is explained by other factors, and I refer to the work of Professor David Swinton, who was at the Urban Institute when he did that research. What are we thinking about when we talk about reparations? We observe these chronic disparities, gaps, inequalities that I briefly outlined in employment, in education, in housing, in healthcare, in commercial business participation, in law enforcement and criminal justice, and in other areas of our life. We search for remedies, but we grope for a clear understanding of the underlying problem and the cause that can be addressed with creative public policy. So why are there these chronic disparities between Black and white outcomes? Religious groups can formally examine systemic, historic, racial, economic relations, or they can advocate for such research. And based on what you find, you can choose to support appropriate restitution, which is targeted, redistributive, restorative, developmental, compensatory public policy and development programs, and that is reparations. Reparations, to me, provides a new conceptual framework for addressing these symptoms and curing the malady. Other people have something else in mind when they speak of reparations. It can be the basis for comprehensive public policy in employment, education, housing, healthcare, commercial equity and business development, so-called minority business development, or Black capitalism as it was called in the Richard Nixon era, law enforcement, criminal justice, and more. These are the symptoms of the race problem. What does reparations mean? There are at least 3 points of view that are out there. First, some people want damages for crimes against humanity and for pain and suffering and punitive damages. Second, others are focused on recapturing unjust enrichment. That's my position. Third, some want the federal government to monitor the economy in an ongoing way, to spot systemic discrimination almost in real time in every sector and account for that with published reports, as we do for other economic activities, such as we measure the money supply, interest rates, employment, housing starts, industrial production, educational performance, agricultural output, and much more. That part of understanding what is happening in the system so that harm can be managed properly with regulation and interventions. There are at least 4 levels of discourse. Level 1 seeks back pay for wage theft during slavery, 1619 to 1865. Level 2 seeks compensation for that wage theft, plus punitive damages for pain and suffering and for crimes against humanity resulting from the transatlantic slave trade between 1619 and 1808, when it formally ended. Level 3 seeks compensation for that wage theft and slavery, plus punitive damages for segregation from 1865 to 1965 and for discrimination from 1865 to 2021. Restitution, in my view, and what I'm seeking or working on is the recapture, recovery, disgorgement of 400 years of unjust enrichment. We could also frame it in another way, that there are 2 primary schools of thought on reparations. School 1 emphasizes pain and suffering, the atrocities of the slave trade and slavery, and makes a case for monetary compensation for those damages. School 2 sees reparations as a technical or technocratic problem. The focus is on measuring income and wealth transfers, and the gains and benefits from enslavement and from abuse of dominance. It finds that there are missing factors in our national income accounts. How we measure economic performance is flawed, incomplete, and misleading because they fail to account for unjust enrichment. That's my point of view. So what's the primary problem? Unjust enrichment. 400 years of excess superaccumulation produced by abuse of dominance, which led to systemic wrongful taking, many kinds of hidden subsidies, blacks subsidizing whites in many ways, unbeknownst to all of us, and many kinds of illicit transactions. I developed these concepts and more in 2 books, The Wealth of Races in 1990, The Present Value of the Benefits from Past Injustices, a compilation of papers by economic historians primarily, and a second book, a policy essay called Paying the Social Debt, What White America Owes Black America, published in 1993. Some might be thinking at this point, what about genetics and inheritable superiority? What about, in other words, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein? There is no evidence that Europeans have an average, systematic, biological, inherited genetic advantage in native intelligence over African Americans. But even if there had been, would it justify abuse of dominance, theft, and unjust enrichment? It is possible that on average, Europeans do score several points higher as measured on currently available tests of 2 of the 6 important types of intelligence, verbal and quantitative analytical. Does that explain or justify unjust enrichment of 10 to 20 trillion dollars or more? Intergenerational effects. Slavery and segregation produced large measurable benefits to the dominant group as a class at the expense of the subordinate group as a class. These benefits were transferred intergenerationally. They were bequeathed down to the present. US economic growth over our entire history was accelerated by the processes that were directly and indirectly based on slavery. We outlawed slavery, but the system of ongoing unjust enrichment in white-black economic relationships was established then, and it continues. These relations diverted or transferred a flow of income and wealth from Blacks as a class to whites as a class. After slavery, segregation and racial discrimination throughout the economy continued to produce similar benefits. White Americans, who are disproportionately in the top 30% of the income and wealth distribution, are part of a class that holds and receives that unjust enrichment. The primary method for accumulating this unjust enrichment was by theft, taking or diverting what would have been Black savings and investment into white savings and investment. This transfer and diversion was then invested in many forms of capital, including human capital. It is held in every asset class today. Human capital, meaning the expected lifetime earnings of everyone walking around, and embedded in real estate, plant and equipment, inventories, public infrastructure, public institutions, and much more. Black labor was exploited by white decision makers in the private and public sectors, working in harmony, if not always in explicit concert. Income and wealth that should have been earned, received, and used by Blacks for their benefit and that of their posterity was instead wrongfully diverted to whites. This occurred indirectly and passively as much as actively and directly. The result, wealth flowed especially into human capital through education and training. This form of capital was built along with the development of institutions of human capital, such as schools and colleges, professional and technical organizations of many kinds, research organizations, and corporations and their training programs. And I should add labor unions and their training programs. Public policy has not closed the Black-white gaps in median family income and wealth. We tried with the Great Society. It was more or less terminated by Nixon and by Reagan. Parts of it remain. Much of it had significant benefits so that the Black middle class has grown since 1965. We're talking primarily about the folks who are stuck at the bottom, about 15 million, about 30% of the 45 million total African-American population. Unjust enrichment redirected grossly disproportionate shares of the common resource pool that was created by the labor and sweat equity of Blacks and whites, overwhelmingly to whites and away from Blacks. This happened in education, for example, building Black schools that were inferior to white schools and creating public institutions, land-grant schools. I went to Penn State. It is such a land-grant school of learning that refused Blacks entry until the 20th century. Job training and an access to housing and commercial finance. This process was expressed through wrongful takings of land and labor through those hidden subsidies that I mentioned of many kinds in education and mortgage financing, from illicit transactions such as charging different prices for the same goods or charging different interest rates when there were no risk differences to justify the differences, and in many other ways. Which brings us to the so what question. Unjust enrichment can be returned. That is what I mean by restitution or reparations. I don't use the word reparations much anymore. It has been hijacked and distorted. Restitution is what I'm talking about. And that means we can recapture, recoup, reclaim and recover this unjust enrichment through the normal workings of the tax and budget process. We know how to do that. Technically, it is not complicated. Emotionally, philosophically, politically, it is complicated. If a political majority decides that the activities were unacceptable and we have made them illegal, which we have, then it is not morally consistent to retain benefits derived from them. Those benefits must be returned. The statistics and measurements will become clearer and more precise as more analysts and scholars focus on this problem, and that is happening, and that is a good thing. Ballpark, the range we're talking about is 5 to 10 trillion initially. The present value of benefits from slavery, segregation, and from later employment and other forms of labor market discrimination. But that is a partial estimate. If we add all benefits derived from educational discrimination, business and capital access discrimination, and residential housing and mortgage discrimination, then it is likely that the figure is in the $20 trillion range, but that's a guesstimate. It'll get better, more precise, more reliable, more credible. This should be returned by restitution to those who should have and would have received it in fair and morally dispensable markets, or to their descendants as a class. How to do that? And this gets a little bit beyond my assigned topic, but programs of targeted direct capital grants for education, housing, and commercial developments are the way to make restitution. That is because African Americans had enough income, even in slavery, to eat and survive. Here we are. We had the very basic necessities, however crude they might have been. What was diverted away was income earned that would have been saved and invested in residential housing, in quality education and skill development, in better health care, and in business development, including agricultural development of many kinds. Those are the forms of capital grants that should be made as restitution for that reason. The objective is that white and black median income and wealth will reach parity, rough equivalence, by a date certain, and I picked 2060, 2 generations from now, 40 years. That would close the median income gap by about 1 percentage point per year. Right now, it's about 60 to 100. So closing it at 1 point per year for 40 years would reach parity. Perhaps some other parity target date is more appropriate. A specific goal is important. That allows us to measure progress every year, and it will sunset and end when that goal is reached. And I'd say a brief word about what I call racial monopoly. We can also apply antitrust logic to the race problem. We have a problem of racial monopoly. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis thought that the proper constitutional objective of government is not to promote efficiency, but to prevent the concentration of power. That can be a guiding principle in correcting racial exclusion and unjust enrichment as well. Today, we see a racial monopoly. Whites control 99%, give or take, of corporate assets. Even though the United States is racially diverse, one race controls every major industry and every major company. That would not have happened without racial monopoly. So one way to make restitution is to modify antitrust policy. And Amy Klobuchar is working on this. She has an important role in antitrust policy modification going forward. So that's social monopoly, what I'm calling social monopoly, which is market conditions in which African-American firms in the aggregate account for less than 5% of total sales or assets in any industry, can be remedied. Breaking up some racially over-concentrated industries for these reasons can apply a well-established antitrust concept more broadly and would improve economic competition. And I will conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks. We will now watch the video Segregated by Design that's based on Richard Rothstein's book. He will be joining us for a question and answer period at the end. Please chat your questions to Lisa Tucker. Thank you.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and the project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of 1 or 2 real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people at the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African-American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African-American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African-American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, It's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship, which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
We will now hear from Dr. Valerie Wilson. Please remember to put any questions you have in the chat to Lisa Tucker.
All right, thank you, Deitra, and good afternoon to all of you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon, and I commend you for passing the resolution to study and seriously consider reparations for the descendants of enslaved peoples here in America, United States of America. This country has been struggling to make sense of or to reconcile the obvious contradictions between the American ideals of freedom, justice, and democracy, and the realities of a racial caste system that assigns social, economic, and political power and status on the basis of race, or as we define race in this country, generally, skin color. So no matter how much we debate the culpability of specific individuals or events throughout history, we are having this discussion about reparations for Black Americans in 2021 because of our failure as a country to fully dismantle the systems and structures that were created to generate unequal outcomes by race and that continue to perpetuate those unequal outcomes. The way that we understand and interpret race and racial disparities in any number of social and economic outcomes really determines how or if we decide to address those disparities. And I think that's really at the heart of our national conversation about race and specifically on reparations. My assignment today, both of the preceding presentations have done an excellent job on laying out the history, some of the history behind race and racism in this country and the outcomes, economic outcomes generated by that. But my assignment today is to discuss racial inequality in its present day context. What does that look like today? How do we observe racism, structural racism in our society today? But before I do that, and in order to do that, I want to go back a few decades to 1968. Not too far back. I think some of you may have been around, been alive in 1968. So it's not so far in the distant future that we're talking about events that preceded any of our lifetimes. But in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson appointed the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders that we better know today as the Kerner Commission. The purpose of putting together this panel of individuals was to investigate civil unrest and overly aggressive policing in Black communities. That probably sounds eerily familiar and similar to some of what's going on in our country today. But after that panel spent several months gathering data and visiting different communities, directly observing and witnessing conditions in urban America, they came to a conclusion. And this panel that was comprised mostly of white men, there were 2 African-American men on the panel, 1 white woman on the panel, both Republican and Democrat members of this committee delivered a report to President Johnson. And in that report, their main conclusion was that white racism was to blame for the pervasive discrimination in employment, education, and housing. And that those conditions, together with widespread mistreatment and abuse of Black citizens at the hands of police, were cited as the causes of poverty and civil unrest in segregated Black communities. Again, this was more than 50 years ago. That commission recommended that there be massive and sustained investments in jobs and education in order to address these problems, and that there also needed to be some reforms in policing. Ultimately, President Johnson declined to pursue any of the commission's specific recommendations. And from that, we can fast forward over 50 years from 1968 and ask, where are we now? What do things look like today? How much has changed? Well, the honest answer to that question of how much has changed in the last 50 years or so is that the results really are mixed. And that is because we have to consider both the absolute and relative progress of Black Americans. On one hand, there is very clear absolute progress in educational attainment. About 50 years ago, a minority of Black Americans completed high school and went on to college. Currently, about a clear majority, over 90%, complete high school. And then, some smaller percentage of those high school graduates go on to college. So there's been clear absolute progress in educational attainment. African Americans today are clearly much more highly educated than 50 years ago. And those educational gains in many ways are reflected, again, relative to 50 years ago, are reflected in improved wages, improved income, and even improved health outcomes for African Americans. But again, this is only comparing African Americans today to what conditions were for African Americans on average about 50 years ago. On the other hand, we've seen much more limited progress in terms of racial inequality in these outcomes, or in terms of measuring Black progress relative to whites over time. To sort of bring that into focus, we have seen no progress or actually have seen regression or lost ground in the areas that you've already heard about today: home ownership, unemployment, and incarceration specifically. I think from those results and that sort of analysis, uh, one thing really stands out to me. Uh, Education is clearly important and an effective tool for economic mobility for people of all races in this country. But education has not been enough on its own to eliminate racial economic inequality. And that's where we are today, having to resolve that issue, or that being one of many issues. And so, what do I mean when I say education is effective for economic mobility, but it does not eliminate racial inequality? To answer that question, I want to share a few examples of how we observe this. The persistent racial disparities that we observe in outcomes in our labor market, for example, in unemployment and wages, arguably provide some of the most compelling evidence of structural racism at work in the labor market specifically. And so I want to talk about two particular gaps that we frequently measure in the study of the labor market, one being the unemployment gap, the other being the wage gap. In terms of unemployment, you've already heard today that Black workers are far more likely to be unemployed than white workers, typically at a rate that is twice as high for African Americans than white Americans. And even at the historically low rates of unemployment that we reached in 2019, just before the pandemic, that 2-to-1 disparity held overall. So on average, comparing the average rate of unemployment for Black workers to that of white workers. But it also was true, and this I think is something that maybe doesn't get highlighted as often as it should. That 2-to-1 disparity we observe also at nearly every level of education. So, on one hand, we may argue that the average 2-to-1 disparity is because we know that rates of educational attainment are, as much progress as has been made, still, are not completely equal. And so those differences may be accounting for differences in people's access to jobs and employment. But the fact that we observe that 2-to-1 at every level of education raises a bigger question about how much of a role education has played or can play in, again, addressing the inequality. Now, it's clear that people with more education, African American college graduates, definitely have a lower unemployment rate than African Americans who only graduated from high school or perhaps didn't graduate from high school at all. But African American college graduates still do not have an unemployment rate that is equal to that of white college graduates. Further, we observe that not only are Black workers twice as likely to be unemployed as similarly educated white workers, but are often more likely to be unemployed than less educated white workers. So again, education has not been the silver bullet for addressing racial inequality and unemployment. Over the last 4.5 decades, only the most highly educated and most experienced Black workers have approached anything near parity in unemployment with their white counterparts, and typically only during periods of exceptionally low unemployment. All of these statistics, these empirical data are consistent with a number of field experiments revealing that Black job applicants with equivalent and sometimes superior credentials to white applicants are less likely to receive job callbacks, and even instances where Black applicants without a criminal background were less likely to receive callbacks even than white applicants who did have a criminal history. So again, the answer to resolving the disparity has not been as clear as improving education and or training. The other gap that I think is very telling in terms of labor market outcomes is what we call the wage gap. So among those who are employed, Black workers face large pay disparities relative to white workers. And in fact, these Black-white wage gaps have grown over the last 40 years, even in a period of time, again, when educational attainment has been increasing. These gaps have actually widened rather than narrowed. And further, the widening of those gaps is largely unexplained by factors associated with individual productivity. So for example, in 2019, the average hourly wage of Black workers was about 26.5% less than that of white workers. Again, that's just on average. That's comparing, the average wage of all Black workers to the average wage of all white workers. However, when we look at a more sort of apples to apples comparison here, relative to white workers with the same education, of the same age, same gender, living in the same geographic region of the country or the same state, the gap was still about 15%. In other words, that means that less than half of the observed Black-white difference in average hourly wage is explained by the main factors presumed to determine pay. There's a large part of that gap that is not explained by differences in education, differences in experience, differences in where you live in the country, differences in economic conditions across different states and regions of the country. The third gap that I want to talk a bit about has been mentioned in the video and talking about housing, and that's the wealth gap. And the wealth gap is arguably most directly linked with the case for reparations. And that gap is significant because we know that wealth affords any number of mobility enhancing opportunities. That includes the ability to purchase and own property, to start a business, to pay for higher education, and to build a secure retirement. So the consequences of the racial wealth gap extend far beyond a single generation because of the access it affords to all of those mobility enhancing opportunities. And inheritance is one of the vehicles by which the wealth gap is also perpetuated. You heard that in great detail in the video that was shown. So wealth is a source of economic security, and it provides a degree of economic stability against uncertainties associated with job loss, for example. Again, those disparate rates of unemployment indicate that Black workers are more likely to experience unemployment and yet have less wealth to sort of bridge the gap in that period of lost employment or lost income. It's also a source of stability against the uncertainty of illness, major illness, or even the death of a household breadwinner. So wealth provides access, wealth provides opportunity, and yes, wealth even provides privilege, both economically, socially, and politically. Now, given all of these numbers and the disparities that I've outlined so far, it's interesting that most Americans actually underestimate the extent of the disparity that continues to exist today. A 2017 study by Yale researchers found that Americans generally think that our society is much fairer in terms of how wealth is distributed across racial groups than what the numbers actually indicate. And not only do people tend to overestimate the progress that has been made on racial economic inequality, they also severely underestimate racial differences in wealth. And so what are the facts? We've heard some of them. I'll go over real quickly. According to the most recent 2019 survey of consumer finances that the Federal Reserve administers, the typical white family has 8 times the wealth of the typical Black family. And that's comparing median white family wealth of about 188,000, 188,100, yeah, 188,200 to about 24,100 for the median Black family. Again, thinking about how this is related to education, these racial wealth disparities persist across education, employment status, and family income. So while median family wealth has grown for both Black and white families over the last 50 to 60 years, the gap between the two, because of many of these factors that we've already discussed, is more than 3 times greater now, currently about $160,000, than it was in 1963. Again, if all of that still seems too far removed from where we are, let's consider something that's very recent, very current, and the racially disparate impact of COVID-19. That, most immediately we've had an opportunity to observe how something that was quite literally universal in terms of its impact across the world. People have been impacted by COVID-19. And yet we saw very disparate outcomes from the effects of that. We've seen that there are large and persistent inequities that existed before COVID that actually became predictive of the needlessly heavy burden borne by African Americans and other communities of color. And those burdens involved anything from job loss. At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw unemployment rates rise by very similar amounts across the board, just because, again, of the widespread nature of the pandemic and the response to it and shutting everything down. Everyone's unemployment rates went up by about the same amount. But as time has progressed, we've started to see those disparities re-emerge, and the patterns and the pace of recovery has been much more uneven. We've seen very disparate outcomes in terms of death by race. We've also seen, and related to that, racial differences in terms of who was compelled to work in unsafe conditions because they were deemed to be a quote unquote essential worker, versus those who had the opportunity to continue working remotely and safely from home, and able to protect both their physical, their health, and their economic well-being. So where does this bring us all to? Statistical analysis often reveals that racial identity is a measurable, significant, and persistent predictor of these and many other economic outcomes. But how often do we actually pause and think about what that really means? In this country, I mentioned before, racial identity is primarily based on skin color. And that is an arbitrary, superficial, and generally fixed characteristics that individuals have no ability to change or alter on their own. So why should race be statistically correlated with one's likelihood of being employed, or how much they're paid for their labor, or any other economic outcome? Again, something that is largely arbitrary and superficial. Why does it have any statistical correlation at all with your productivity or economic outcomes? And until that question is one that we no longer have to ask, meaning that we've seriously considered the historical, structural, and institutional factors that continue to perpetuate racial inequality apart from individuals' actions or decisions. Until we no longer have to ask ourselves that question, I think reparations for Black Americans deserves serious consideration among the various solutions that are to be considered for finally addressing these longstanding and generational disparities. And with that, I will stop. And I think at this point, we're going to move into the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your words and your years of study. I'm struck with really almost that last part of what Dr. Wilson was just talking about, those systems of racism. And we heard about the systems from each of you. And so I'm wondering, and thank you, Mr. Rothstein, for joining us. So I'm wondering, what can reparations help to redress some impacts of those systemic, institutionalized, racist, those systems and the unjust enrichment, especially that Professor America was talking about, how the unjust enrichment that whites have benefited from Blacks all these years.
Would you like me to?
Sure, that'd be great.
Sure, okay. Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to participate today. The problem, I think, with reparations is that most Americans think of reparations as a single monetary payment to the current generation of African Americans, leaving aside the difficulty of administering such a program. Even if we were to enact such a single monetary payment, it would inevitably be too token to really fix this problem. As Valerie just finished describing, this is a multi-generational problem. It can't be fixed with a single payment, a single token payment. What we need is, of course, we need very expensive programs to redress the inequality that we've created. But we need more than just expensive programs. We also need a lot of policies that cost nothing. Now, all of these in the broad sense are reparations, if by reparations you mean repairing damage that was done. But I'm concerned about using a term that excuses us from really thinking hard about what policies we should enact. For example, in the video that you saw, I focused a lot on housing and the exclusion of African Americans from single-family homes that were subsidized by the federal government. In those suburbs that were created in the mid-20th century by really the federal government, subsidizing the developers. At the time, they sold for $100,000. As you've heard, they now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. That is a big disparity. What the federal government should be doing is buying up homes in those suburbs for market rates and reselling them at deeply discounted rates to African Americans so they can afford now to live in communities from which they've been excluded. That would be a very expensive program. But there are many other things that we should be doing that cost nothing at all. We should, for example, be prohibiting communities from adopting zoning ordinances or maintaining zoning ordinances that effectively exclude African Americans by prohibiting the construction of even townhouses and garden apartments or condominiums or low-level apartment complexes that fit in well with the character of a residential community. That doesn't cost anything to abolish those zoning ordinances. I consider it a form of reparations, but that's not what most people think of when they hear the term reparations. We also have many policies that reinforce segregation because of their disparate impact, and they're not racially explicit in intent, and sometimes just accidental, but they have a disparate impact because when you build upon an existing unequal structure, any policy is going to affect African Americans and whites differently because they're starting in different places. So there's been a lot of attention recently, for example, to the fact that property assessment systems in virtually every county in this country have a discriminatory effect. Not a discriminatory intent, but a discriminatory effect. African Americans are paying much higher property taxes than whites are paying for homes of similar value, and therefore African Americans are paying a bigger share of the costs of schools and libraries and fire departments than they should. Well, not only should we be reforming the way in which we do property assessments to prevent this from being an ongoing problem, but we should also be issuing refunds to African Americans who have been overtaxed for many, many years. So the range of policies we should be following is very broad. I try to avoid the term reparations because I think people misunderstand it. Of course, in a deep sense, all of these things are a form of reparations, but we need policies, some expensive, some inexpensive, to redress this situation.
Thank you. Professor America. Oh.
You're muted.
You need to unmute.
Restitution is disgorging unjust enrichment through the tax and budget process. We can't force that to happen, but it's becoming clearly a social scientific fact that can be further measured and refined, that whites have an unjust enrichment embedded in their balance sheets in every form of asset. And the progressive tax system is the mechanism for recapturing that over the next 40 years. And then through various specific programs, primarily in hard grants, checks for housing, education, and business development. That's restitution. It's straightforward.
Thank you. And Dr. Wilson.
So what I will add to this is, again, to give some other examples of how systems help to perpetuate these unequal outcomes in the labor market in particular. So much of the decision-making process is really blind to an applicant. When you apply for a job, you may or may not know who else is applying. You don't know what happened in that interview process. You don't know what the deliberations are behind the scenes. You don't know what was offered to another candidate. And often when people are employed, they don't know what their coworkers are earning, and sometimes are prohibited from even asking or having conversations about that. So one of the things that I think perpetuates inequity is the secrecy and a lack of transparency in how these various decisions are made. So again, and not that I think it will be completely cost-free, because there would be a cost associated with having to report and collect and maintain that data. But I think it's important that there be greater transparency and some reporting requirements around pay, in addition to the data that the EEOC already collects on hiring and promotions by race, ethnicity, and gender, and national origin. So I think transparency would be an important part of that. But beyond that, again, any individual employer can make the decision that they want to have a more equitable and just process associated with how they recruit, how they hire, how they promote, and can set up the process that will help facilitate that on their own. It doesn't necessarily have to be legislated. But again, in order to address these inequities, our solutions have to be intentional. It won't just sort of fall out because the structure, the system has been in place for so long. People know who they know, they live where they live, they go to work, in church where they go to work. And so because our society has had generations of being segregated and separated, in order to really address the disparities that's caused, eliminating those gaps has to be the explicit goal and target. And we have to then take intentional steps to sort of undo how that system is creating the unequal outcomes.
Mhm.
Look, religious groups, or at least Judeo-Christian religious groups, and I think it's broader than that. I'm not an expert on Buddhism, Islam, or other forms, but I think thou shalt not steal is a universal principle. We're talking about 400 years of theft. When there is such theft, the remedy is to cough it up, return it. It's not complicated. Now, as I said, philosophically, emotionally, politically, it's very complicated, but technically it is not. And so I would, if I had a crystal ball, I would say that the fact that we're having this conversation, which wouldn't have happened 10 or 20 years ago, even though this work has been going on for 50 years or more, that's progress. And I'm optimistic by nature. I do believe that a supermajority, 60% or more of the voters will arrive at a consensus that they want to do the right thing. And that means they will tax themselves and make restitution. It won't happen this year. It might not happen in the next 10 years, but it will happen. And this principle will apply, by the way, in many other situations around the world where there are deep ancestral grievances. The grievances are expressed in terms of religion or ethnicity or language or culture, but underneath there's an economic issue, and the issue is your ancestors ripped off my ancestors. That's what's underneath most lingering conflicts in Northern Ireland, the French and the English in Canada, the Middle East, the Balkans, the Hutus and the Tutsis, and on and on. And they can be resolved, I believe, by careful economic analysis, putting the facts on the table, and then we will have a basis for rational problem solving. That will become standard in diplomacy over the next generation or two.
Thank you so much to each of you. It is 4:19, so we did extend our time a bit. There are a lot of wonderful questions that we got in the chat that we were not able to get to today. We do have part 3 of this 3-part series next week, 3 p.m. Eastern. We will be focusing on the Jewish perspective. And so we'll take more of the moral and religious point of view and really try to put everything together and answer many of the questions that are still outstanding. And we also have a resource page for people to dig deeper and to understand many of the points in why reparations should be seriously considered, as Dr. Wilson has put it. Thank you each for your time, and thank you everyone for being here, and we hope to see you again next week.
Thank you for the opportunity.